who would Georgia want to play? So we know Ohio State's going to be rooting for Utah. Who's Georgia rooting for? Isn't that kind of a fun question? Georgia's a really good team. Really good team. In fact, statistically, when you look at what they're scoring, what they're giving up, not all that different. In fact, eerily similar to last year's team that went on to win the national championship. Now, we could all say, like, we don't think that their defense is quite as dominant as what that team's defense was. Remember, at this point in the season, their statistics, if you will, their point totals were way lower than what they ended up being because Bama got after them in that SEC championship game, put up a lot of yards on them also in the national championship game. But who does Georgia want to play? It's just such a fun thought experiment. So initially, if you're anything like me, you immediately go to the quarterbacks and you're like, well, both of them are really good. Right? You've got Stroud, you've got Caleb Williams. But do you really want to see Caleb Williams? You're like, I don't know if I would want to see Caleb Williams. I don't know if I would want to see Jordan Addison. You know, Lincoln Riley's offense, this is always an offense that's going to put pressure on a defense. They can run it really well with a good identity. They can obviously throw it. Williams is playing out of his mind. But I actually think it's Ohio State who they don't want to see. Now, they might say, like, we don't care. And fair enough. Absolutely. And you know what? If you're a competitor, you probably want to take that mindset anyways. But if you're a Georgia fan, and I know a lot of you out there, who do you want to see? Is it USC or is it Ohio State? I would assume, and as you got kind of go through it, you would probably rather see USC. The reason is while their quarterback is playing out of his mind, yes, the roster for USC in its totality is not anywhere close to what the roster for Ohio State is. And Ohio State is probably the only team in the country up to this point that any of us have said, like, yeah, you know, they match up decently with Georgia. Maybe not a great matchup, but decently, as opposed to anybody else. Because, by the way, Georgia matches up with Michigan. That's like looking in a mirror. Michigan's not going to be able to out-tough Georgia. We'll get to that matchup potentially down the road. But Ohio State, they can get out there and do what Alabama did to Georgia last year, which is threaten them vertically. Okay, so when you start actually looking at the roster and you start looking at the makeup of this team, yes, like Georgia doesn't want to see USC lose. That's going to be a much tougher game for them in the semifinal if they have to face the Buckeyes. And by the way, it's not unprecedented that a really good team loses late in the season and can still go on and win the national title. You know how I know that? Because you did it just last year. Just last year. Didn't show up for the SEC championship game, got kind of run against Bama, and then ultimately won the national championship. So who's to say that Ohio State can't fix some of the things that went wrong for them in the last 7 minutes and 20 seconds against Michigan and roll out there and play really well in the playoff? In the good weather, in a dome. So that's a tougher matchup for Georgia. If I'm a Georgia fan, I've got my USC sweatshirt on Friday night because I would rather see USC, at least in my estimation, than Ohio State in a national semifinal.